Hi, so I wanted to just go over some PowerPoint images of some of the things that I talk about in the micro lecture and let you see them and see what they're about. So I'm going to share my screen here. I need my glasses. Yeah, old eyes. There we go. Okay, so these slides that I want to show you are just some of these images of railroads because I think it's so important to the development of both the West and the industrialization of the United States. You absolutely have to have both the railroad and for the development of either. So I just wanted to share some images because I think it really helps with the understanding of what they're talking about in the textbook and then what I talk about in the lecture. Okay, so this is a slide out of your textbook because I think it's just interesting and shows some of those big economic change points from 1870 to 1920. And this really kind of helps, I think, tie together those ideas of that growth in the West and the industrialization in the East and how those two things go together and what impact they have on the American economy besides the American society as a whole. But this shows the economy. So if you look there that the farms from 1870, the amount of land that's being farmed more than doubles to 1900, just in those 30 years. The amount of wheat that is grown, you can see that exponential growth, and then they grow again coming to 1920. So I think that shows that expansion of the West. Remember, we talked in the West module about the idea of that Homestead Act in the late 1860s and how that's going to exponentially increase the number of people who are moving to the Midwest and the number of people who are farming. So you can see that in the raw numbers there with the land in millions of acres farmed. That's 408 million acres farmed in 1870 to 841 million acres farmed in 1900. So huge increase. Manufacturing employment is the next one there, and you can see that growth as well. And then you can see the change in the workforce and how it's going to change. And we'll talk about this again when we get to the 1920s. But there's a real shift in the number of people working in agriculture versus industry in 1870 and agriculture and industry in 1920. You can see there's a real flip there. And then these railroad tracks, the amount of railroad tracks in 1870 compared to 1900 and 1920, the amount of steel produced, and so forth. You can also see the life expectancy goes up quite a bit in those years as well. 42 was the life expectancy in 1870. All right. So I want to talk about the railroads, and again, I'm going to go over them and a little bit in the micro lectures. They'll be part of it. But one of the big things in this time period is the growth of railroad. And this is going to impact the industry, the steel industry and things like that. It's going to impact the growth in the West. It's going to impact the cattle industry. It's going to impact everything. So this is 1860 map. This is right before the American Civil War. And you can see where the railroads are, right? You've got some railroads in the South. You've got a lot of railroads in the Northeast coming across, kind of ending there in Missouri, a little bit down here in Texas, and then one little blip there out in California, and that's out near where the gold rush was and things like that, that you're going to have that. But you can see where most of the growth is. And of course, if we were talking about the Civil War, this would be part of our conversation, this idea of how the industrialized North has so many more transportation opportunities than the agricultural South. Another piece of this that, again, I'll talk about a little bit in the micro lecture, but it's important to recognize that the way these railroads were designed was there were lots of different railroad companies, and every railroad company did it a little differently, right? So the gauge is, you see a railroad and you see the tracks, and the gauge is how wide the tracks are, right? How wide apart the tracks are. and every railroad company laid their own gauge, right? Some were this far apart, some are this far apart. And of course, if you think about this, if the gauge is different, then a train has to be fitted to that particular gauge. So if you have some of these points on here where you can see my cursor here. I forgot I was sharing the screen. You know, if a train is coming out of Indianapolis and wants to go through Kentucky and Tennessee to deliver goods, and the gauge of the track changes, they've got to take everything off of that train car, put it on a train that could then travel on the next track, right? So there's a lot of railroad in 1860, but you can see that it's all a bit of a hot mess, right, with these different gauges, right? So we fight the Civil War, and as we're getting done with the Civil War, and even during the Civil War, you have this idea of expanding to the west, and you have the growth of the transcontinental railroad to the Pacific, and Union Pacific is based out of Omaha right here. And I grew up in Omaha, so I could sing you the Union Pacific song if you'd like, but I think you probably wouldn't like me to, but it's a good one, right? Union Pacific. Can never resist it. But I won't sing you the whole ad that used to run on TV when I was a kid. But Union Pacific starts here in Omaha, and they run this blue line. And they're going to have a lot of immigrants that are doing this, a lot of those Swedish and Norwegian immigrants that we talked about before, but a lot of Irish immigrants are going to come in this time period and help build this railroad from the east, from Omaha toward the west. And then the Central Pacific Railroad is going to build this red line. Here's that little blip of green that we saw before. That's going to be added later to the coast. But that Central Pacific Rail line is going to go from the west. Now you can see this one's a lot longer. Both are going to have to deal with mountains, right? The Sierra Nevadas and the Rockies, and get through those. This red line is going to be built with a lot of immigrants as well, Mexican immigrants. A lot of Chinese immigrants are really, really important to the building of that Central Pacific Railroad. And then they're going to meet here in 1869, and I've got another slide here, at Promontory Point, Utah. So you can see right here, and they have a big ceremony, and they drive a golden spike into the ground to celebrate East and West meeting together. And finally at the Promontory Point, Utah. And I will say that in Omaha, they used to hold Golden Spike Days, and it was a big festival that they would hold in Omaha for many decades. I never saw it. It was in my grandmother's day, but we've got pictures of her in her golden spike outfit and dress and everything like that. So it was a really big event for Omaha. But so if we're going to look at this map again, why is this important? Why do we care if we have a transcontinental railroad? And I want you to think about that and think about why we would want that transcontinental railroad, why we would want it to go all the way across. What that would mean is, you know, think about your readings about the growth and development of the West, the expansion of the West, and the expansion of the industrialized East, and how beneficial to both of those goals for the nation that expansion of that railroad would be. Right, so we've seen this 1860 map. We've got our transcontinental railroad, woohoo, big party time, right? And then this is what the railroad looks like in 1870. And you can see now that transcontinental railroad is included on that map. And note how little railroad lines there are out here besides that transcontinental railroad. That's it. So you've got the growth out here in the east. You've got some new railroad here in the south, and a real growth in this time period. You know, something like 52,000 miles are going to be built in this time. That's a growth of about 20,000 miles of railroad from 1860. And, you know, really we were busy with the war before that. But look at the mass of growth here, right here in the Midwest and in these industrialized places. I'm going to go back to that 1860 map for a minute for you, right? Look at what these areas look like in 1860. Now look at them here in 1870. Just so many little lines going out throughout this whole region. And then again, that one line going out to the west. So as you're thinking of that transcontinental railroad, my hope is what you thought about it was this idea that, you know, we can take wagons from the east out west and horses, or we can take boats all the way around South America to come up to California, which is something they did. Or now we can get on a train and go all the way across the country, right? Both as individuals and as businesses, right? We can take all that iron ore and other minerals that are being mined out here in the West. We can take all the agricultural goods and get them out west, right? So all that mining and materials can get out to the east, to the industrialization. All the farming and goods can get back out to the west. So it really just changes everything. Now this, I want you to watch, this little line here, especially since we're in Texas, right? And here's the next one. Look at this. All of Kansas gets railroads all the way across, right? You get lines up from Texas up to Kansas. See, now there's railroads all the way down through New Mexico territory and Arizona territory. Now remember, there are people that live here. Native Americans live here. They have their own ways of life. And they're going to be deeply influenced by this. Even Dakota territory is going to have trains. So just all over the United States, you have the development and growth of these trains. In the 10-year period from 1870 to 1880, something like 40,000 miles of railroad are going to be built. So just a huge amount of railroad, which is going to make it easier to communicate. It's going to make it easier to connect with one another, trade, moving people, moving goods, moving letters from those immigrants that move out here. All of a sudden now you can get your letter back east and on a ship to go home. So it makes everything faster and everything much more connected, right? And then look at this one. I just think this is incredible. This is 1890. Huge explosion in the amount of railroads, over 70,000 new lines during that decade, meaning that making the total lines over 163,000 miles. You've got several lines going all the way to the Pacific, so it's not just that one transcontinental railroad anymore. Just a huge amount of mileage. And the slide here says in the 30 years from 1860 to 1890, the total mileage of the trains west of the Mississippi River here is going to increase from 2,175 miles worth of track to over 72,000. So think about that and what that's going to mean for the population of this area. And this is just another image of it. I wanted to show you this map because it's color and I like color maps. But it shows some of the big cities on here and some of the different railroads, right? The Pennsylvania Railroad, the New York Central, the Northern Pacific, the Union Pacific. I won't sing this time, I promise. The Central Pacific, the Southern Pacific, Illinois Central, right? So all these different rail companies. And this map actually also shows the time zones that we live with today, the Pacific time zone, the Mountain time zone, our own Central time zone, and the Eastern time zone. And it's the railroads that set those time zones up so that they can be on time, so that they can say, okay, in Dallas, it's 1 o'clock. In New York, it's noon. You know, and they can regulate things and make sure it's all the same and all on time across the country. Right. This is just another visual of the amount of railroad, thousands of miles of railroads that are being built in this period. This one actually goes out through to the 1970s. And you can see there's this big burst that we're talking about today. And then there's another little chunk here as we get up to the more industrialized era. And then we get deep into the 20th century, the 1920s and 30s, and it all drops off. There's just no need for more. The rail lines that we have here in Denton and across Texas are pretty much the rail lines that were built in this earlier period. They may have changed the track and the cross timbers, but it's the same routes. So those aren't counted anymore. Right. This is the one I wanted to show you, right? Remember we talked about the rail lines in Kansas, the rail lines in Nebraska. Go back to your discussion or thoughts about the growth of the West. And we talked about the ranching and ranging and those big cattle drives up to the different rail lines. And this is what we're talking about. As these rail lines come closer and closer, those cattle drives don't have to go all the way up here anymore. As you get the rail lines in, say, Fort Worth, you can have a stockyard in Fort Worth, and they can all get on the train there and then take the train up to the slaughterhouses in Chicago or Omaha or wherever. So it really does change the framework of the work that must be done in the West. Okay, and I like this map too because it shows the different mining regions, and you can see how the rail lines are close to the different mining strongholds, right? And that's so that they can take the mined goods, put them on the railroad, and get them where they need to go, primarily the industrialized East. Right? That's the only reason you would put this Southern Pacific Rail line right where it is, because you've got all these copper, gold, and silver mines down here, and then you can do things with them. So that industrialization, that commercialization of the mining of the West to feed the industry of the East helps spur the need and the will for the railroads. This is just an image that I was going to show you last week with the American West. We talked about that elimination of the food source for Native Americans, and that the trains, once those trains were put into place, that this is something that they would do. And they would literally take a short train. You can see this image only has 2 or 3 cars, fill it with hunters, and go out on the rail line and then kill as many buffalo as they could. There's a old movie with Kevin Costner called Dances with Wolves, and this is portrayed in that. It's an interesting film. And that's all I have for you on those. I think about the importance of the railroads and how they're going to influence so many different things. And again, I'll talk about them in our other little micro lecture, but I wanted you to see these images. So I'll reference these when we're talking about it as well. But the railroad is really important. Your textbook does talk about the importance of steel and the importance of the railroads. And so be sure to look for those as well. Okay, let's see, I'm going to stop share so I can stop recording. All right, let me know if you have questions.